So, here's something to think about as you settle in tonight. Right now, somewhere within a few feet of you, there's a conversation happening. Not the kind with words. A conversation made of radio waves, so faint and so fast that your body has no way of noticing it. Your phone is talking to your earbuds. Your smartwatch is talking to your phone. Maybe your car is talking to all three at once, sorting out who gets to play the music. You don't hear any of this. You don't feel it. You just press play, and somehow the sound arrives in your ears half a second later, with no wire in sight. We call this Bluetooth. We say the word so casually now that it barely registers as strange. But if you stop and actually ask yourself what's happening, how two separate pieces of plastic and silicon, sitting a few inches apart, manage to find each other, trust each other, and hand data back and forth thousands of times a second without ever touching, you end up somewhere surprisingly deep. And that's where we're going tonight. Slowly. No rush. We're not just going to talk about pairing your earbuds. We're going to start further back than that. We're going to start with a king, an actual, historical, sword-wielding king from over 1,000 years ago, whose name got borrowed for a piece of technology he could never have imagined. Because that's the strange thing about Bluetooth. It's not an acronym. It's not a made-up marketing word like so much of the tech around it's a name. A real person's name, or at least, a real person's nickname, plucked out of medieval Scandinavian history and stuck onto a radio chip. We'll get to him soon, we have to, because understanding why engineers in the 1990s reached backward 1,000 years for a name tells you something important about what they were actually trying to build. It wasn't just a wireless cable, it was something bigger than that, a kind of unification. But before the king, before the name, before any of the technical details about frequencies and hopping and pairing, I want you to sit with a simpler question for a moment. Why did we need this at all? What problem was so annoying, so persistent, so universally shared across every device-owning human on Earth that an entire industry of competitors decided to set aside their rivalries and solve it together? The answer, as it so often is with these stories, starts with something mundane, something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. It starts with cables. Think back, if you're old enough, or just imagine if you're not, a desk from the late 1980s or early 1990s. A computer sits in the middle of it, and radiating out from the back of that computer is a small forest of wires. One for the keyboard, one for the mouse, one for the printer, thick and stubborn, always tangled with the others. One for the modem, screeching its way onto the internet. Each cable had its own connector, its own protocol, its own reason for existing, and none of them talked to each other. And it wasn't just computers. Every gadget you owned wanted its own cable, its own charger, its own dock. Cordless phones existed, but they were cordless in only the loosest sense, tethered to a base station that itself was tethered to the wall. True freedom from wires, the kind where two devices could just find each other in the air and start working, didn't exist yet. Not in any practical, everyday way. This is the world Bluetooth was born into. A world drowning quietly and unglamorously in cables. And somewhere in Sweden, in the offices of a telecommunications company most people had never heard of, outside the industry, a couple of engineers started asking a question that would eventually untangle all of it. We'll meet them properly in a little while. But first, the king. Because you can't understand the name without him, and honestly, it's a good story. Just relax and let's go back. Not to the 1990s yet. Further, all the way back to the 10th century, to a cold northern kingdom, and a ruler with a very particular reputation, and, according to legend, a very particular tooth. Let's go back to the year 958, or thereabouts. We're in Denmark, in the cold, salt-sprayed lands of southern Scandinavia, and a man named Harald Gormson has just become king. Harald wasn't the first king of Denmark, but he was, in a real sense, the first king of a unified Denmark. Before him, the region was a patchwork of tribes and petty kingdoms, loosely connected at best, often at war with each other. Harald's father, Gorm the Old, had started the process of consolidation. Harald finished it. He brought Denmark together under a single crown, and then, through a mix of alliance, conquest, and sheer persistence, he brought much of Norway under his influence as well. He also did something else that mattered enormously for the people living under him, and for the story we're telling tonight, though nobody at the time could have known it. He converted to Christianity, and he brought his kingdom with him, ending centuries of Norse paganism as the dominant faith in Denmark, at least officially. There's a large carved stone from this era, the Jelling Stone, raised by Harald himself, that boasts of exactly this achievement. He united Denmark and Norway, and he made the Danes Christian. It's practically a resume, carved in granite, over 1,000 years old. Now, here's where the nickname comes in, and honestly, historians aren't entirely certain where it came from. The most common explanation is delightfully literal. Harald may have had a conspicuously dead or discolored tooth, one that appeared dark, almost blue-black. In Old Norse, this earned him the nickname Blatun, Bluetooth. There are other theories, softer and less anatomical. Some historians think the nickname might be a mistranslation or a later embellishment, a bit of medieval nicknaming that stuck regardless of its literal accuracy, the same way historical figures across every culture end up with epithets that outlive the facts behind them. But the tooth story is the one that survived, the one that got passed down, and the one that, 1,000 years later, would end up mattering to a room full of engineers in a way nobody could have predicted. What matters most for us isn't the tooth itself. It's what Harald actually did. He took separate, often quarreling factions, and he unified them under one banner. Tribes that didn't trust each other, regions that had spent generations fighting. He brought them together, not through erasing their differences entirely, but through building something that connected them. Now, jump forward almost exactly 1,000 years to 1996 and 1997. A group of engineers from competing technology companies that in any other context would be fighting tooth and nail over market share, are sitting in meetings trying to agree on a wireless standard. It is slow going. Everyone wants their own version to win. Everyone has incentives to push their own protocol, according to the story that's been told and retold in the industry. An Intel engineer named Jim Kardach was reading a historical novel at the time called The Longships by the Swedish author Frans G. Bengtsson. It's a sweeping, adventurous tale set in the Viking Age, and Harald Bluetooth features in it as a unifying figure, bringing rival factions together. Kardach, sitting in these frustrating cross-company meetings, made the connection. Here they were, engineers from Ericsson and Nokia and Intel and IBM and Toshiba, all rivals, all trying to unify their competing short-range wireless efforts into a single standard, just like Harald had unified warring Scandinavian tribes into a single kingdom. He suggested Bluetooth as a temporary code name for the project, something to use internally until marketing came up with something more polished, more sellable, more appropriately corporate. It never got replaced. The temporary name stuck, the way temporary things sometimes do when they turn out to fit better than anyone expected. And the logo, the one you've seen 1,000 times on the side of a speaker or in the corner of your phone's settings screen, isn't abstract at all once you know what you're looking at. It's built from runes, specifically the younger Futhark runic alphabet that Harald himself would have recognized. The rune Hagel, which looks roughly like an X with an extra line, representing the letter H, and the rune Bjarkan, a kind of angular B shape, representing the letter B. Combine them, overlap them into a single bind rune, and you get the Bluetooth logo, H&B Harald, hiding in plain sight on a billion devices. It's a strange little piece of trivia, but I think it tells you something true about what the engineers were actually trying to accomplish. They weren't just building a faster cable replacement. They were trying to get an entire industry full of competing companies with competing standards and competing agendas to agree on one shared way of talking. Unification, just like the king. Different companies, different devices, one common language. So now you know where the name comes from. But the name is the easy part. The harder question, the one that actually took years of quiet, frustrating engineering to answer, is this: how do you actually build a technology that lets two nearby devices find each other without wires, without confusion, without draining a phone's battery in an afternoon, and without interfering with every other wireless signal in the room? That story doesn't start with a king. It starts with an office in Lund, Sweden, and two engineers at a phone company wrestling with a much more immediate and unglamorous problem, namely, the tangle of cables strangling every desk in the modern world. To understand why anyone bothered inventing Bluetooth, you have to understand just how genuinely irritating the world of cables had become by the late 1980s and early 1990s. Picture an office worker's desk from that era. A beige computer tower sits underneath it, or beside it, cables trailing from its back like roots. A keyboard wired, a mouse wired, and often with a cable so short you had to keep your hand within a tight, awkward radius of the machine. A printer sat nearby, connected by a thick, stiff parallel cable that seemed engineered specifically to resist being coiled neatly. If you had a modem, that was another cable, snaking to a phone jack on the wall, occupying the household's single phone line and making a screeching, grinding noise every time it connected. Now multiply this by every device a person owned. A cordless phone, which despite its name was tied to a base station, plugged into both power and the phone line. A Walkman or early portable CD player with its own charging cable, incompatible with anything else in the house. A calculator, a pager, eventually early mobile phones, each shipping with its own proprietary charger, its own proprietary connector, its own little brick of a power adapter that you had to keep track of and never ever lose. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was expensive, wasteful, and it actively limited what devices could do. If your headset had to be physically wired to your phone, you couldn't leave your phone in your bag while wearing the headset. If your printer had to be wired to your specific computer, you couldn't easily share it with another machine in the same room. The cable wasn't just an accessory. It was a hard boundary on how far apart two cooperating devices could ever be. Engineers, being engineers, had already tried to solve this. One of the earliest attempts was infrared, often shortened to IR, standardized in the early 1990s by a group called the Infrared Data Association, or IRDA. You may remember this if you owned a laptop or a phone from that era. There'd be a small dark window, usually near the edge of the device, and if you lined it up carefully with a matching window on another device, you could transfer files or print documents without a cable. Infrared worked by sending pulses of light, invisible to the human eye, back and forth between two devices. And it did work, technically. But it had a fundamental limitation baked into its very nature. Light doesn't bend around corners, and it doesn't pass through objects, which meant infrared devices needed a direct, unobstructed line of sight to communicate. If you moved your hand between them, the connection dropped. If the devices weren't pointed at each other with reasonable precision, nothing happened at all. It was wireless, technically, but it demanded almost as much careful positioning as a cable would have. It also tended to be slow, and it only ever worked between exactly two devices at a time. facing each other, usually within a few inches. It solved a narrow slice of the problem. It didn't solve the bigger one. The bigger problem, the one that engineers at various companies were independently starting to circle around in the early 1990s, was this. What if two devices could find each other using radio waves instead of light? Radio doesn't care about line of sight in the same way. It passes through your pocket, through a bag, through a wall, at least for short distances. A signal broadcast by radio spreads out in all directions, meaning devices don't need to be pointed at anything. They just need to be nearby. This wasn't a new idea in any grand sense. Radio itself was already a century-old technology by this point. What was new was the specific challenge of doing this cheaply, using very little power, over very short distances, in a way small enough to fit inside a mobile phone or a headset, and reliable enough that ordinary people, not engineers, could use it without thinking about it. Because here's the thing about radio waves that makes this harder than it's crowded. There are radio stations, television broadcasts, walkie-talkies, cordless phones, garage door openers, baby monitors, all sharing the same general electromagnetic neighborhood, each carefully assigned their own narrow slice of frequency by government regulators, so they don't stomp all over each other. Building a brand new radio technology meant finding a slice of that spectrum that was actually available to use cheaply anywhere in the world without needing a broadcasting license. And it meant solving an even trickier problem underneath that. If you put a dozen Bluetooth-style devices in the same room, all trying to talk over the same general patch of radio spectrum at the same time, how do you stop them from talking over each other? How does your phone's connection to your headset avoid getting garbled by your neighbor's phone doing the exact same thing 20 feet away? Nobody had a clean answer to all of this yet. But by the early 1990s, several people at several different companies were starting to ask these exact questions, largely without knowing the others were asking them too. And one of the most important places this was happening, quietly, without much fanfare, was a research lab belonging to a Swedish telecommunications company in the city of Lund. It's there that our next chapter really begins, because two engineers at that company were about to spend years of careful, unglamorous, frequently frustrating work turning this vague wish, this dream of a cable-free world, into something that actually functioned. And their solution would eventually end up in the pocket of nearly every human being on the planet. The company was Ericsson, and if that name sounds vaguely familiar, but you can't quite place it, that's understandable. Ericsson was, for decades, one of the giants of the mobile phone world, a Swedish telecommunications company with roots stretching back to the 1870s. Originally repairing telegraph equipment, before eventually becoming one of the most important players in the birth of the mobile phone industry. By the early 1990s, Ericsson was deeply invested in making phones smaller, smarter, and more useful, which meant its engineers spent a lot of time thinking about accessories. Headsets, in particular. A headset meant you could talk on the phone without holding it against your face, which was appealing for obvious reasons. But every headset on the market was wired, which meant you were still, in a sense, tethered. In 1994, a small team at Ericsson Mobile in Lund began investigating whether there was a better way. Two names come up again and again in the history of this project: Jaap Haartsen and Sven Mattisson. Haartsen, a Dutch engineer, and Mattisson, a Swedish one, were both working within Ericsson's research division, and together they began exploring what was internally referred to as a short-link radio technology. The original ambition was modest, at least on paper. They wanted to replace the cable between a mobile phone and its headset with a radio link. That's it. A narrow, specific, practical problem. get rid of one annoying wire. But solving even that narrow problem required tackling several genuinely difficult engineering questions all at once. And it's worth sitting with them for a moment, because these are the exact questions that would define Bluetooth for the next 30 years. First, power consumption. A mobile phone in the mid-1990s already had a battery life measured in hours, sometimes barely surviving a single day of moderate use. Adding a radio system that constantly hunted for and maintained a wireless connection could not be allowed to meaningfully worsen that. Whatever they built had to sip power, not gulp it. Second, cost. This wasn't going into a laboratory prototype meant to impress investors. It needed to eventually be cheap enough to put inside every single phone Ericsson sold, which meant the chip, the antenna, the whole system, had to be inexpensive to manufacture at massive scale. Third, size. A mobile phone in 1994 was already, by today's standards, a fairly substantial brick of plastic. There wasn't a lot of spare room inside for a radio system. Whatever Haartsen and Mattisson designed had to be small enough to disappear into a device that was itself trying to shrink. And fourth, and this is the one that would end up defining so much of what came later, reliability in a crowded, unpredictable radio environment. A phone and a headset wouldn't just be used in a quiet laboratory. They'd be used on crowded trains, in busy offices, in homes with cordless phones and baby monitors and microwave ovens all humming away nearby, each one potentially interfering with a delicate new radio signal trying to hop between a phone and someone's ear. Haartsen and Mattisson worked through these problems methodically over the following years, refining what would eventually become the technical backbone of Bluetooth. We'll get into the actual mechanics of how they solved the interference problem in a little while, because it's genuinely elegant and worth its own careful explanation. But for now, what matters is this. By the mid-1990s, Ericsson had developed the beginnings of a working short-range radio technology, and importantly, they had also arrived at a realization that would prove just as important as any of the engineering. A wireless standard is only useful if other people build devices that support it too. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If Ericsson built this technology purely for its own headsets and its own phones, it would work technically. But it would also be a dead end. A headset that only ever connected to Ericsson phones is a niche accessory. A wireless technology that every phone, every laptop, every printer, every keyboard, every future device could speak, regardless of who manufactured it. That's something else entirely. That's infrastructure. That's a language everyone could learn. But convincing an entire industry full of rival companies who spent their days competing fiercely against each other to adopt a shared wireless standard developed by one of their competitors was never going to happen by Ericsson simply announcing it and hoping for the best. Nobody wants to build their product around a proprietary technology owned and controlled by a rival. So Ericsson made a decision that, in hindsight, looks obviously correct, but at the time required a real leap of trust and strategic patience. Instead of trying to own this technology outright and license it competitively to others, they decided to open it up. They reached out to other major players in the mobile and computing world and proposed something unusual. Let's build this together. Let's form an alliance, contribute our combined engineering knowledge, and create an open standard that any company, including our direct competitors, could adopt freely. It's a genuinely interesting moment in technology history because it runs against the instinct most companies have, which is to guard your inventions jealously and extract maximum profit from every advantage. Ericsson essentially decided that a shared standard, one that could become truly universal, was worth more to everyone, including themselves, then a proprietary technology they controlled alone, but that never achieved wide adoption. In 1997 and into 1998, those conversations, quiet at first, began to take real shape. Ericsson approached Nokia, another giant of the mobile phone world, and in most other contexts, a fierce competitor. They also brought in Intel, whose processors powered the world's computers, IBM, a titan of the broader computing industry, and Toshiba, a major manufacturer of laptops and consumer electronics. 5 companies, 5 sets of competing interests, 5 different corporate cultures, all of them agreeing to sit at the same table and hammer out a wireless standard that none of them would fully own, but all of them could use. It's worth pausing on how unusual this was, and it's exactly the kind of unlikely unification that a little later in this story would remind one particular engineer of a particular Viking king and give this entire technology the name it still carries today. On May 20th, 1998, these 5 companies, Ericsson, Nokia, Intel, IBM, and Toshiba, formally announced the creation of the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, usually just called the Bluetooth SIG. This wasn't a company in the traditional sense. It wasn't trying to sell a product or turn a profit directly. It was something closer to standards body, an organization whose entire purpose was to define, maintain, and promote a shared wireless technology that any member, and eventually any licensed company at all, could build products around. These 5 founding companies became known, somewhat grandly, as the Bluetooth Founders, and their logos appeared together on the earliest official documentation. It's a genuinely unusual sight if you know the industry. Nokia and Ericsson, at the time 2 of the largest mobile phone manufacturers on Earth, locked in fierce competition for market share in nearly every country where phones were sold, standing shoulder to shoulder on the same press release, agreeing to share a fundamental piece of technology. Rather than fight over it, why would they do this? The honest answer is that everyone involved recognized something important. A wireless standard that only worked within one company's ecosystem was a dead end, as we touched on a moment ago. But a wireless standard that worked everywhere, that any headset could use with any phone, that any keyboard could use with any computer, that any printer could use with any laptop, regardless of manufacturer, would create enormous value for the entire industry and by extension, for everyone participating in it. A bigger pie, shared, was worth more than a smaller pie, fought over. There's a term for this kind of arrangement that gets used a lot in business and economics circles. Competition. Cooperation and competition happening simultaneously in the same relationship. Nokia and Ericsson would go right on competing furiously to sell more phones than each other. But underneath that competition, they'd share a common wireless language, because a rising tide of universal wireless connectivity would lift every phone manufacturer's boat, including their own. Over the following months, the SIG grew. More companies joined as adopters and contributors, eventually numbering in the thousands over the following decades. Everyone from massive electronics manufacturers down to small startups building niche accessories. But the core engineering work, the actual technical specification, moved forward under the guidance of engineers largely drawn from those original 5 companies, building directly on the foundation that Haartsen and Mattisson had laid at Ericsson years earlier. It's worth sitting for a moment on what this technical specification actually needed to define. This wasn't just an agreement to use a particular radio frequency. It was closer to an entire rulebook describing precisely how devices should discover each other, how they should establish a connection, how they should exchange data reliably, even with interference present, how they should manage power consumption, and how different categories of devices, a headset versus a keyboard versus a file transfer between 2 laptops, should each behave according to shared but distinct sets of rules. Writing this rulebook took time, negotiation, and no small amount of technical disagreement, as 5 separate engineering cultures worked to reconcile their approaches into a single coherent standard. But by the summer of 1999, roughly a year after the SIG's formation, the first official specification was ready. Bluetooth version 1.0 was published in July of 1999. It's easy to skip past a moment like this, a version number and a publication date, but I want you to sit with what it actually represented. This was, for the first time, a complete publicly available document describing exactly how any manufacturer, anywhere in the world, could build a device capable of speaking this new wireless language and be confident it would understand and be understood by devices built by completely unrelated companies, thousands of miles away, who had never spoken to each other directly. That's a genuinely remarkable kind of trust to build into a technical document. It requires that every detail, every edge case, every assumption about timing and power and radio behavior be spelled out with enough precision that a device built by, say, a small Japanese electronics company in the year 2003 could seamlessly pair with a headset built by an entirely different American company in the year 2005, with neither engineering team ever having spoken to the other. That precision is the quiet, unglamorous foundation that everything else in this story rests on. The very earliest Bluetooth-equipped products started reaching the market not long after, and we'll get to those, and to their genuinely clunky, imperfect, occasionally frustrating early years, a little later in our story. But first, I think it's worth slowing down even further and actually explaining what's happening at the most fundamental physical level when 2 Bluetooth devices talk to each other. Because everything we've discussed so far, the king, the cables, the alliance of rival companies, all of it exists in service of a genuinely elegant piece of physics. And to understand that physics, we need to talk about what radio waves actually are and why a particular sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, largely ignored by everyone else, turned out to be exactly what this new technology needed. So let's slow all the way down and go back to basics. What actually is a radio wave? And why did a Swedish engineering team, sitting in an office in Lund in the 1990s, end up choosing the same slice of invisible spectrum that your microwave oven uses to heat up leftovers? Let's talk about radio waves, gently, without rushing, because everything that follows in this story depends on understanding this properly. A radio wave is a kind of electromagnetic wave, which means it's made of the same fundamental stuff as visible light, as X-rays, as the microwaves that heat your food, as the infrared warmth you feel from a fire. All of these are electromagnetic radiation. What separates them from each other isn't their basic nature, it's their frequency, and correspondingly, their wavelength. Think of it this way. An electromagnetic wave oscillates back and forth like a ripple traveling across the surface of a pond, except instead of water, it's oscillating electric and magnetic fields, pushing and pulling on each other as they travel outward through space at, or very close to, the speed of light. Frequency is simply how many times that oscillation repeats every second. A low-frequency wave oscillates slowly, with long, lazy ripples stretched out over a large distance. A high-frequency wave oscillates rapidly, with tight, compressed ripples. Radio waves, as a category, sit at the lower frequency end of this electromagnetic spectrum, well below visible light, well below infrared even. AM radio stations broadcast at frequencies measured in the hundreds of kilohertz. FM radio stations broadcast in the tens of megahertz. Television broadcasts occupy their own band. Cell phone networks occupy others. Every one of these uses, and every frequency band that carries them, is carefully regulated by government bodies around the world. Because if two broadcasters tried to use the exact same frequency in the same geographic area, their signals would collide and garble into noise. This is actually the central challenge that faced Haartsen, Mattisson, and later the entire Bluetooth SIG. They needed to find a slice of radio spectrum to build their new short-range technology around. But nearly every useful slice of spectrum was already spoken for, licensed out to television networks, radio stations, government agencies, mobile phone carriers, each paying enormous sums of money for the exclusive right to broadcast within their narrow assigned band. Building a new consumer wireless technology on licensed spectrum would have been a non-starter. It would mean every single Bluetooth chip manufactured anywhere in the world would need some kind of broadcasting license, varying by country, an absolutely unworkable mess for a technology meant to sit inside a $2 headset. Fortunately, there was an alternative. Tucked within the broader radio spectrum sat a small handful of frequency bands that most countries had, decades earlier, set aside as unlicensed. These are known as the ISM bands, short for industrial, scientific, and medical. Originally, these bands were reserved for equipment that generated radio frequency energy as a side effect of doing something else entirely: industrial heating equipment, certain medical devices, scientific instruments, none of which were actually trying to broadcast a communication signal. Because this equipment wasn't being used for broadcasting in the traditional sense, regulators decided it didn't need the same strict licensing that radio and television stations required. Anyone could use these bands for free without a license, as long as they followed certain power limits and technical rules designed to keep interference manageable. One of these ISM bands sits at 2.4 gigahertz. And if that number sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same frequency band your microwave oven operates in. Microwave ovens work by generating radio energy at roughly 2.4 gigahertz, which happens to be a frequency that water molecules absorb particularly well, causing them to vibrate and generate heat, which is how your microwave cooks your food. It's also, not coincidentally, why standing very close to an old poorly shielded microwave oven while it's running can sometimes cause noticeable interference on a nearby Wi-Fi router or Bluetooth connection. They're literally sharing the same slice of the invisible spectrum. When Ericsson's engineers, and later the broader Bluetooth SIG, went looking for an unlicensed slice of spectrum that would be available essentially everywhere in the world, without needing separate approval in every single country, the 2.4 gigahertz ISM band was an obvious and attractive candidate. It was free to use. It was reasonably wide, offering enough room to work with. And crucially, because it had been set aside decades earlier as an unlicensed band nearly everywhere on the planet, a Bluetooth chip built in Sweden could, in principle, work identically in Japan, in Brazil, and Australia, without needing a different design for each region. But here's the catch, and it's an important one. Precisely because this band was free and unlicensed, lots of other things wanted to use it too. Early cordless phones, baby monitors, garage door openers, and eventually a competing technology that would grow up alongside Bluetooth and become nearly as ubiquitous: Wi-Fi, which also settled on the 2.4 gigahertz band for many of its own connections. This meant that any Bluetooth signal traveling through the air was by design sharing its neighborhood with a genuinely chaotic crowd of other devices, all shouting their own signals into the same small patch of invisible spectrum, with no central authority coordinating who spoke when. A cordless phone in your kitchen, your neighbor's Wi-Fi router leaking through the wall, a baby monitor 2 rooms over, all of them, potentially, colliding with the delicate radio link trying to carry sound from your phone to your headset. So the engineers building Bluetooth faced a genuinely difficult puzzle. They had chosen a slice of spectrum specifically because it was free and universally available. But that same openness meant their signal would constantly be competing with noise, interference, and outright collisions from a crowded, unregulated, unpredictable radio environment. How do you build something reliable? Something that can carry a phone call or stream music without constant dropouts in the middle of that kind of chaos? The answer that Haartsen and Mattisson arrived at, and that eventually became one of the defining technical signatures of Bluetooth, is genuinely clever. Rather than trying to find one quiet, uncontested slice of frequency and camp out there hoping nobody else showed up, they designed the system to never sit still at all, to constantly move, to hop, again and again, thousands of times a second, across dozens of different frequencies within that band, making it remarkably resistant to interference in a way that a stationary signal simply couldn't be. This technique has a name, and it has a surprisingly dramatic history of its own, one that predates Bluetooth by more than half a century, and involves, of all things, a Hollywood actress and a World War II torpedo. We'll get to that story next, and to exactly how frequency hopping actually works, in careful, unhurried detail. Let's talk about frequency hopping, and let's start, oddly enough, not with Bluetooth at all, but with a torpedo, and an actress most people only know from old black and white films. During the Second World War, radio-guided torpedoes faced a serious vulnerability. If an enemy ship detected the guidance signal being broadcast to steer the torpedo, they could jam it, drowning out the real signal with noise, and send the torpedo harmlessly off course. In 1942, an American inventor and film composer named George Antheil, working alongside the actress Hedy Lamarr, patented a proposed solution. Instead of broadcasting the guidance signal on one fixed frequency, which an enemy could easily locate and jam, what if the transmitter and receiver both jumped rapidly between many different frequencies, in a pattern synchronized between them, but appearing essentially random to any outside listener? An enemy trying to jam the signal would need to jam every single frequency in the hopping pattern simultaneously, which was far harder than jamming one fixed channel. Lamarr and Antheil's patent, though it wasn't widely used by the military during the war itself, described exactly this idea, and it's now recognized as one of the foundational concepts behind what's called frequency hopping spread spectrum, a technique that would resurface decades later in a very different context, solving a very different problem. That different context was exactly the crowded, chaotic 2.4 GHz ISM band that Haartsen and Mattisson had chosen for their new short-range radio technology. And the problem it solved wasn't enemy jamming, it was ordinary, everyday interference. Cordless phones, baby monitors, microwave ovens, and eventually Wi-Fi routers, all competing for space in that same small patch of unlicensed spectrum. Here's how it actually works inside classic Bluetooth. The 2.4 GHz ISM band, as used by Bluetooth, is divided into 79 separate channels, each 1 MHz wide, spanning from roughly 2402 MHz up to 2480 MHz. Rather than picking one of these 79 channels and sticking with it, a connected pair of Bluetooth devices agree on a pseudo-random hopping sequence, and then jump between different channels within that sequence up to 1,600 times every single second. Sit with that number for a moment. 1,600 hops every second, back and forth across the available spectrum, in perfect synchronization between two devices. Your phone and your headset aren't just talking on one frequency. They're playing an extraordinarily fast game of leapfrog together, moving in lockstep, spending only a tiny fraction of a second on any single channel before jumping to the next one in their shared sequence. Why does this help with interference? Imagine your neighbor's cordless phone is happily broadcasting on say channel 40 of that spectrum, right at this exact moment. If your Bluetooth headset were sitting still on channel 42, that interference could genuinely disrupt your connection, garbling the audio or causing a dropout. But because your Bluetooth connection is hopping rapidly across all 79 channels, it only spends a tiny fraction of its time anywhere near channel 40 at all. And even when a collision does occasionally happen, when your hop briefly lands on a frequency someone else happens to be using at that exact instant, the disruption is brief, often a single lost packet out of many, easily recovered by the system without you ever noticing. It's a bit like trying to have a conversation in an incredibly crowded, noisy room, except instead of standing in one spot and shouting over everyone else, you and your conversation partner have agreed, in advance, on a rapid sequence of spots to briefly stand in, one after another, moving so quickly that any particular source of noise in the room only ever catches a small fraction of what you're saying, and your listener catches the rest just fine. This constant hopping also serves another quiet purpose. It makes Bluetooth signals inherently a bit harder to eavesdrop on or interfere with intentionally, compared to a signal sitting still on one predictable frequency. Someone trying to listen in would need to know and track the exact hopping sequence in real time, which, while not truly unbreakable security by any means, adds a genuine layer of difficulty on top of whatever encryption is layered over the connection itself, which we'll get to in a later part of our story. Now, here's something worth pausing on. This entire system only works because both devices agree precisely on the same hopping sequence and stay synchronized to it, hopping to the exact same channel at the exact same instant, thousands of times a second, without ever drifting apart. If your phone hops to channel 12 while your headset is still expecting to find it on channel 40, the connection falls apart entirely. How do two separate devices, with separate internal clocks, running separate pieces of hardware, manage to stay in this kind of extraordinarily tight synchronization? The answer involves something called a piconet, a small, temporary network formed between Bluetooth devices, governed by a relationship that's often described using surprisingly hierarchical language. One device becomes what's called the master. Every other device connected to it becomes a slave, and it's the master's internal clock that everyone else agrees to follow. That relationship, master and slave, piconet and clock offset, is genuinely central to understanding how Bluetooth devices coordinate with each other, and it's where we're headed next. Because it's not enough to simply agree to hop through frequencies together. Somebody has to be in charge of the rhythm, keeping time so that everyone else in the little wireless neighborhood knows exactly where and exactly when to be listening. Let's talk about how Bluetooth devices actually organize themselves once they've decided to talk to each other, because it's a surprisingly structured little arrangement with clearly defined roles, and it's worth understanding slowly. When two or more Bluetooth devices connect, they form what's called a piconet, a small, temporary, local network, usually involving anywhere from 2 up to 8 active devices total. The name itself is a small linguistic joke of sorts, built from the prefix pico, meaning extremely small, combined with network. A tiny network formed on the fly, existing only as long as the devices involved choose to stay connected, and dissolving the moment they don't. Within a piconet, the devices aren't all equal participants in a flat, democratic sense. One device takes on a role called the master. Every other connected device becomes what's called a slave. Now, this terminology has, understandably, drawn criticism over the years for its unfortunate historical associations, and more recent wireless standards and much of the industry have moved toward gentler terms like central and peripheral. But master and slave is the original terminology baked into the early Bluetooth specifications, and it's worth understanding, both because you'll still encounter it in technical documentation, and because the actual functional relationship it describes is genuinely important to how the system works. So, what does being the master actually mean, practically? The master device is the one that sets the rhythm. Remember that rapid frequency hopping sequence we talked about a moment ago, the 1600 hops per second dance that both devices need to follow in perfect lockstep. It's the master's internal clock that defines this sequence. The master essentially says, here is our shared hopping pattern, and here is exactly when we started it, and every slave device connected to that master synchronizes its own behavior to match. Think of it a little like a small group of dancers following a single conductor. The conductor doesn't need to dance identically to everyone else. The conductor sets the tempo, and everyone else watches closely and moves in time with it. If the conductor speeds up or changes the pattern, the dancers follow. Without a single shared reference point like this, keeping several independent devices, each with their own slightly imperfect internal clock, synchronized to within microseconds of each other, 1600 times a second, would be extraordinarily difficult. Having one device set the tempo and having everyone else simply follow along elegantly sidesteps that problem. A single master can, in principle, coordinate connections with up to 7 active slave devices simultaneously within one piconet. Though in practice, most everyday Bluetooth connections you actually use involve just one master and one slave, a simple pair, like your phone and a single headset. Now, here's a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it can be a little counterintuitive. The role of master isn't a fixed property of a particular device, like it's baked permanently into the hardware. It's a role that gets assigned when a connection is first established, typically based on which device initiates the connection process. Your phone, when it first connects to a new pair of earbuds, generally takes on the master role because it's the device driving the process of discovering and connecting to the earbuds. But in a different scenario, that same phone might end up as a slave to a different master device entirely, depending on the context of that particular connection. There's also a subtlety worth mentioning here, which is that a single device can, in more complex setups, participate in more than one piconet simultaneously, acting as a slave in one piconet, while also acting as the master of an entirely separate piconet involving different devices. When this happens, the overlapping structure is given its own name, a scatternet, a slightly whimsical term for a slightly more chaotic real-world scenario, where multiple small piconets overlap and interconnect through a device that participates in more than one at once. It's not something you, as an ordinary user, ever consciously think about, but it's quietly happening in more complex Bluetooth environments, offices full of multiple connected devices, conference rooms bristling with laptops and headsets and speakers all trying to coexist in the same small patch of radio spectrum. So, to bring this back to something concrete and familiar, when you take your phone out of your pocket and your wireless earbuds automatically reconnect, what's actually happening underneath the surface is this. Your phone, acting as the master, begins broadcasting its presence and its intended hopping sequence. Your earbuds, acting as the slave, recognize your phone as a device they've connected to before, synchronize their internal timing to match your phone's clock, and begin hopping in perfect unison across those 79 channels, 1,600 times a second, all before you've even finished lifting the case to your ear. This entire elaborate coordination, the clock synchronization, the shared hopping sequence, the master keeping time while the slave follows, happens automatically, silently, in a fraction of a second, every single time you use a Bluetooth device. It's genuinely one of the more elegant pieces of quiet engineering hiding in your everyday life. But synchronized hopping alone doesn't answer a slightly different and equally important question. How do two devices that have never met each other before, your brand new headphones straight out of the box, and your phone that's never seen them, actually find each other in the first place, agree to trust each other, and establish that shared secret hopping pattern to begin with? That process has its own name, one you've almost certainly encountered directly, usually accompanied by a small blinking light and a slightly nerve-wracking wait to see if it actually works. Pairing. And it's a genuinely interesting story in its own right, involving cryptography, evolving security standards, and more than a few embarrassing early vulnerabilities that the industry had to quietly fix along the way. Let's talk about pairing, because it's the part of this entire process that you, personally, actually experience. Everything we've discussed so far, the frequency hopping, the piconets, the master and slave roles, all of it happens silently, invisibly, in the background. Pairing is different. Pairing is the moment where Bluetooth briefly surfaces into your conscious awareness, usually accompanied by a blinking light on a new device, and a short, slightly tense wait to see whether your phone will actually find it. So, what's actually happening technically during those few seconds when a Bluetooth device wants to be discovered for the first time? Whether that's a brand new pair of headphones straight out of the box, or an older device that's been reset, it enters what's called discoverable mode. In this mode, the device begins broadcasting a small, repeating signal announcing its presence, along with some basic identifying information, its device name, the general category of device it is, and a few technical details about what it's capable of. Meanwhile, your phone, when you open its Bluetooth settings and tap something like Add New Device, enters a corresponding mode, actively scanning across the available frequencies, listening for exactly these kinds of discoverable broadcasts. This scanning and broadcasting dance on its own doesn't require the tight, synchronized frequency hopping we discussed earlier. That level of precise coordination only kicks in once a connection is actually established. Before that point, discovery happens through a somewhat looser, more exploratory process, both devices essentially calling out and listening in the crowded 2.4 gigahertz neighborhood until they happen to notice each other. Once your phone spots the headphones broadcast and you select them from the list, the two devices begin what's genuinely, without exaggeration, a cryptographic negotiation. They need to agree on a way to trust each other and on a shared secret they can use going forward to protect their connection from eavesdropping. In the earliest days of Bluetooth, this trust-building process relied on something called a PIN code. You may remember this from older devices, particularly things like Bluetooth headsets used with early mobile phones. You'd often need to manually enter a 4-digit numeric code, sometimes something genuinely as simple as 0000, into both devices. or sometimes the code was fixed and printed directly on the device itself. Both devices would use this shared PIN, combined with some additional technical information, to mathematically generate a shared secret key, which they'd then use to encrypt everything they sent to each other going forward. This worked in the sense that it prevented completely casual eavesdropping, but it had real weaknesses. Many devices shipped with the same simple, predictable default PIN. Someone with the right knowledge and the right equipment could, under certain conditions, intercept enough of the pairing exchange to mathematically work backward and recover the PIN, and from there the encryption key protecting the connection. It wasn't catastrophically broken for most casual, everyday use, but security researchers quite reasonably found real problems with it as the years went on and Bluetooth found its way into more sensitive applications. The fix arrived with Bluetooth version 2.1, released in 2007, in the form of something called Secure Simple Pairing, usually just abbreviated SSP. And the improvement here is genuinely elegant, resting on a piece of mathematics that, if we're being honest, deserves its own slow, careful bedtime story someday. Public key cryptography, and specifically, a technique called Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Here's the beautifully strange idea underneath it, described gently, without the heavy mathematics. Imagine two people standing in a crowded room full of eavesdroppers who need to agree on a shared secret number without ever actually saying that number out loud where anyone else could hear it. Public key cryptography makes this genuinely possible through mathematical operations that are easy to perform in one direction, but extraordinarily, almost impossibly, difficult to reverse. Each device can generate a piece of information, share it completely openly, in full view of any potential eavesdropper, and yet the two devices can still combine their respective pieces to arrive at a matching, shared secret that nobody merely listening in could ever reconstruct, even having heard every single part of the exchange. With Secure Simple Pairing, your headphones and your phone can establish this shared secret without you ever needing to manually type in a 4-digit code at all. In many common scenarios, sometimes you'll still see a brief confirmation step, a number displayed on both devices that you're asked to compare and confirm matches, which protects against a more sophisticated kind of attack where someone tries to secretly insert themselves into the middle of the pairing process. But the underlying cryptographic heavy lifting, the part that actually protects your connection from being casually intercepted, happens automatically, invisibly, in the background, in a fraction of a second. Once this pairing process completes successfully, both devices store the resulting secret information, often called a link key, in their own memory. This is exactly why the next time you turn on your headphones near your phone, you don't need to go through this entire discovery and cryptographic negotiation process again. Both devices remember each other, remember their shared secret, and can quickly, quietly re-establish an encrypted, synchronized connection, hopping together across those 79 channels without you lifting a finger or even fully waking up from whatever you were doing. That quiet, automatic reconnection, the one that happens every single time you open a case of wireless earbuds, rests on everything we've discussed so far. A shared name, borrowed from a 1,000-year-old Danish king, a slice of unlicensed radio spectrum, hopping 1,600 times a second to dodge interference. A master and a slave, keeping perfect synchronized time together. And underneath all of it, a small piece of genuinely elegant cryptography, quietly protecting a connection that most of us never think about at all. But there's still an important piece of this puzzle we haven't touched yet. Once two devices have found each other, trusted each other, and synchronized their hopping, how do they actually agree on what kind of data they're sending? A keyboard sending keystrokes needs to behave very differently from a pair of headphones streaming music, which needs to behave very differently again from two laptops quietly transferring a file in the background. That's where we're headed next, into the hidden languages, the Bluetooth profiles that quietly determine what your devices are actually allowed to say to each other. And how for now though, that's 9 parts down. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll continue with the next set. Let's pick back up where we left off. Two devices have found each other. They've paired, exchanged their secret keys, and synchronized their rapid hopping across the 79 channels of the 2.4 gigahertz band. They trust each other now, but trust alone doesn't tell them what to actually say to one another. Think about how differently a Bluetooth keyboard needs to behave compared to a pair of Bluetooth headphones. A keyboard needs to send small, precise bursts of information the instant a key is pressed. A single letter, a modifier key, nothing more. And it needs to do this with almost no delay, because even a tiny lag between pressing a key and seeing it appear on screen feels wrong to a human typing quickly. Headphones, on the other hand, need to receive a continuous, steady stream of audio data, tolerating a small amount of buffering delay in exchange for smoother, uninterrupted sound. If every Bluetooth device simply sent raw data however it pleased, chaos would follow. A headset manufacturer and a keyboard manufacturer, working independently, with no shared understanding of how audio data should be packaged and sent, would end up building devices that technically used the same underlying radio technology, but couldn't actually understand each other's messages. This is the problem that Bluetooth profiles solve. A profile is essentially a specialized rulebook sitting on top of the basic Bluetooth connection that defines exactly what kind of data a particular type of device sends, how it's formatted, and what both sides are expected to do with it. Think of the underlying Bluetooth connection, the pairing, the hopping, the synchronized clock, as the equivalent of two people agreeing to speak the same language. A profile is more like agreeing on a specific dialect, tailored to a specific conversation. Let's walk through a few of the most important ones, slowly, because you interact with these constantly without ever knowing their names. The Advanced Audio Distribution Profile, almost always shortened to A2DP, is the one responsible for streaming music from your phone to your wireless headphones or speaker. It defines how compressed audio data gets packaged, sent, and reassembled on the receiving end, aiming for reasonably high audio quality while still fitting comfortably within Bluetooth's available bandwidth. When you press play on a song and it comes out clearly through your earbuds, A2DP is quietly doing the work underneath. Alongside A2DP, there's usually a companion profile called AVRCP, the Audio-Video Remote Control Profile, which handles a slightly different job. It's what lets you press the play, pause, or skip button on your headphones themselves and have that command travel back to your phone, telling it to actually control the music playback. Then there's the hands-free profile, HFP, and its older sibling, the headset profile, HSP, which handle phone calls specifically. rather than music. These profiles are responsible for carrying your voice and the caller's voice back and forth in real time, with much stricter requirements around delay, since a noticeable lag in a phone conversation is immediately jarring in a way that a tiny audio buffering delay in music simply isn't. Separately, there's the Human Interface Device Profile, HID, which governs keyboards, mice, and game controllers. This is the profile prioritizing low latency above almost everything else, since the entire point of a keyboard or mouse is instantaneous responsiveness. And there's the File Transfer Profile and the related Object Push Profile, which handles sending files directly between two devices. A photo shared between two old phones, for instance, back before cloud storage, made this kind of direct file transfer feel almost quaint. Over the years, as Bluetooth found its way into more and more categories of devices, the list of official profiles grew substantially, eventually numbering in the dozens, covering everything from medical devices, measuring blood pressure, to fitness trackers reporting heart rate, to car systems, reading a phone's contact list for hands-free calling. Here's what I find genuinely elegant about this layered design: sitting profiles on top of the core Bluetooth connection, rather than baking specific behaviors directly into the base technology itself. It means Bluetooth, as a foundational wireless system, never had to be redesigned every time someone invented a new category of device. Engineers could simply define a new profile, a new specialized dialect, while relying on the same underlying radio foundation that a headset from a decade earlier was already using. It's a bit like how a single spoken language can support wildly different kinds of conversations. A doctor's diagnosis, a marriage proposal, a football commentary, without needing to reinvent grammar and vocabulary from scratch each time. So when your keyboard, your headphones, and your fitness tracker are all connected to your phone simultaneously, and somehow none of them get confused about which data belongs to them, this layered system of profiles, quietly running in the background, sorting audio streams from keystrokes from heart rate data, is a big part of why. But knowing how the technology was supposed to work on paper in a specification document is a different thing entirely from watching it actually work out in the real world on real hardware, held by real, occasionally frustrated early adopters. And the very first Bluetooth products to reach store shelves had a genuinely bumpy road ahead of them. That's where we're headed next. Before we leave profiles behind entirely, it's worth mentioning one more, because it quietly demonstrates just how far this idea of layered, specialized dialects eventually stretched. The health device profile, developed years after Bluetooth's earliest days, defines exactly how medical equipment, a blood pressure cuff, a glucose meter, a digital thermometer, should format and transmit clinical readings. A blood pressure cuff built by one manufacturer can, in principle, report its readings to health tracking software built by an entirely different company, simply because both sides agreed years in advance to speak the exact same specialized dialect. This is really the quiet genius sitting underneath the entire profile system. It let Bluetooth grow sideways into industries and use cases nobody at Ericsson could possibly have anticipated back in 1994, without ever needing to touch or destabilize the careful radio engineering underneath. The foundation stayed fixed. The vocabulary spoken on top of it simply kept expanding, one new profile at a time, to match whatever the world decided to build next. By the year 2000, The Bluetooth specification existed. The engineering was sound, at least on paper, and the founding companies were eager to actually put this new wireless technology into people's hands. But there's always a gap, sometimes a fairly large one, between a technology working correctly in a laboratory and that same technology working correctly in someone's actual, messy, unpredictable living room. The first Bluetooth-enabled products started trickling onto the market around 2000 and 2001. Among the earliest and most notable was a wireless headset released by Ericsson itself, a chunky, slightly awkward-looking device by today's standards, worn hooked over one ear, connecting wirelessly to a compatible phone. It was, in a very real sense, the entire original point of this whole project finally made physical. No cable between phone and ear. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange and slightly futuristic this must have seemed to an ordinary person encountering it for the first time. Seeing someone walking down a street, seemingly talking to themselves, no phone visible, no cable in sight, was genuinely unusual enough that it drew stares before it eventually became commonplace. But early adoption came with real growing pains, and it's worth being honest about them, because they tell you something important about how difficult it actually is to translate a technical specification into a smoothly functioning consumer product. Pairing, in these early years, was often genuinely fiddly. Users frequently had to manually enter matching PIN codes on both devices, sometimes fumbling through unfamiliar menus on a phone with a tiny screen never designed for this kind of task. Devices from different manufacturers, despite technically following the same shared specification, sometimes behaved subtly differently in ways that caused confusing, hard-to-diagnose connection failures. Battery life was another persistent early complaint. The radio technology itself was designed with power efficiency in mind, but early implementations, running on the relatively primitive chip technology of the era, still drew a noticeable toll on a phone's battery, especially compared to simply using a wired connection that required no active radio at all. Range and reliability could also be inconsistent. While the specification promised a working range of roughly 30 feet under ideal conditions, real-world walls, furniture, and interference from the crowded 2.4 GHz band could shrink that considerably, or introduce occasional dropouts that felt, to an ordinary user with no understanding of frequency hopping, simply unpredictable and frustrating. And there was, frankly, a real skepticism in the broader tech press and among early users about whether this whole wireless business was worth the hassle at all. Cables, whatever their annoyances, were reliable and simple. Early Bluetooth devices had to overcome not just technical hurdles, but a genuine, reasonable consumer skepticism about whether wireless convenience was worth trading away that dependable simplicity. Despite all of this, adoption grew steadily through the early and mid-2000s. Laptop manufacturers began building Bluetooth support directly into their machines, rather than requiring a separate add-on adapter. Mobile phone manufacturers increasingly included Bluetooth as a standard feature rather than a premium extra. Car manufacturers began integrating Bluetooth hands-free calling systems directly into vehicles, recognizing a genuinely compelling use case. Each new category of successful product built confidence in the underlying technology and gave the Bluetooth SIG real-world feedback about what needed refining. The specification itself continued evolving through this period, with later versions addressing exactly the kinds of complaints early adopters had been voicing: faster connection speeds, more reliable pairing, better power management. By the middle of the decade, roughly around 2004 and 2005, Bluetooth had genuinely crossed over from a niche, slightly finicky novelty into something approaching a mainstream expectation. A new phone without Bluetooth support was starting to feel notably behind the times, rather than the reverse. But even as Bluetooth found broader acceptance, it existed in an interesting kind of tension with another wireless technology that had emerged around roughly the same period, sharing the exact same crowded slice of unlicensed radio spectrum, but built to solve a fairly different problem. And understanding how these two technologies, so often confused or lumped together by ordinary users, actually differ from each other is genuinely worth slowing down for. It's worth remembering, too, that all of this early hardware struggle was happening against a backdrop of genuine industry cooperation, continuing quietly in the background, even as individual manufacturers stumbled through their own implementation quirks. The Bluetooth SIG kept meeting, kept refining the specification, kept publishing updated guidance meant to iron out exactly the inconsistencies frustrating early adopters. Bluetooth 1.1, arriving in 2001, and Bluetooth 1.2, arriving in 2003, were both, in large part, quiet corrective efforts, tightening ambiguous parts of the original specification that had allowed different manufacturers to interpret the same rules in slightly incompatible ways. By the time Bluetooth 2.0 arrived in 2004, bringing with it a meaningful speed increase through something called enhanced data rate, the technology had matured considerably from those first, slightly clumsy headsets of 2000 and 2001. It's a pattern worth noticing because it repeats throughout this entire story. Bluetooth rarely improved through one single dramatic leap. It improved the way most durable, widely used infrastructure improves through patient, incremental refinement. One specification revision responding honestly to the previous version's real-world shortcomings. People confuse Bluetooth and Wi-Fi constantly, and it's genuinely understandable why. Both are wireless. Both often operate in that same crowded 2.4 GHz ISM band we spent so long discussing earlier. Both became household terms around roughly the same period in the early 2000s. So let's slow down and actually compare them properly, because the differences are rooted in genuinely different design goals from the very beginning. Wi-Fi, which traces its own origins back to a separate standard, finalized in 1997 by a different standards body called the IEEE, was designed primarily to connect devices to a broader network. Most importantly, the Internet through a central access point, your router. Its design goals prioritize speed and range above almost everything else. Blodano, as we've spent this entire story exploring, was designed with almost the opposite priorities. It was never meant to replace your internet connection. It was meant to replace a short, simple cable between two nearby devices. Its design goals centered on low power consumption, low cost, and reliable operation over short distances, typically within about 30 feet rather than raw speed or wide coverage. This difference in priorities shows up clearly if you compare their typical technical characteristics side by side. Wi-Fi, even in its earlier versions, could move data dramatically faster than Bluetooth. sufficient for streaming video across a household network, something Bluetooth was never intended to handle. Wi-Fi also typically consumes considerably more power than Bluetooth, particularly classic Bluetooth, designed for constant, low-power background connections. This is precisely why your laptop's Wi-Fi radio drains its battery noticeably faster than a Bluetooth mouse connected to that same laptop drains its own tiny battery. Range tells a similarly divergent story. A typical home Wi-Fi router can often maintain a usable connection throughout an entire house. Classic Bluetooth, by contrast, was deliberately designed around a much shorter range, reflecting its intended use case, connecting devices that are genuinely near each other, on your body, on your desk, in your car. There's also a structural difference worth mentioning. Wi-Fi networks typically rely on a central access point, your router, that every device connects through. Bluetooth, through the Piconet structure we discussed earlier, tends to work more directly, device to device, without necessarily requiring any central infrastructure at all. Given how differently these two technologies were designed, it becomes clearer why the industry never seriously considered simply merging them into one. They're solving genuinely different problems. Wi-Fi answers the question, how do I connect this device to a broader network quickly across a wide area? Bluetooth answers a different question entirely. How do I connect this device to another nearby device, cheaply, reliably, without draining its battery? In practice, this means the two technologies coexist constantly, often within the very same device, working alongside each other rather than competing directly. Your phone uses Wi-Fi to download a song from a streaming service. That same phone then uses Bluetooth to send that already downloaded song a few feet through the air to your headphones. There is, admittedly, one genuine point of friction between them, and it's worth acknowledging honestly, because both technologies frequently operate in that same crowded 2.4 GHz band. They can, under certain conditions, interfere with each other. Engineers on both sides of this relationship have spent considerable effort over the years developing techniques to minimize this mutual interference. It's not a perfectly solved problem even today, but it's dramatically better than it was in Bluetooth's earliest years. So Bluetooth found its lane, comfortably coexisting alongside Wi-Fi rather than competing against it. And adoption continued growing steadily through the 2000s. But classic Bluetooth still carried one persistent, nagging limitation, the same one that had quietly worried early users from the very beginning: battery life. And solving that limitation properly would require Bluetooth to undergo one of the most significant transformations in its entire history. It's worth adding one more layer to this comparison, because it explains why you'll sometimes see the two technologies working together even more closely than simple coexistence. A feature developed later, generally described as Wi-Fi Direct on one side of the industry, and various Bluetooth-assisted connection handoffs on the other, allows devices to actually use a Bluetooth connection as a kind of quiet introduction, exchanging just enough information to then establish a separate, faster Wi-Fi link for a specific task, like transferring a very large file between two phones. Bluetooth handles the easy discovery and low-power handshake. Wi-Fi handles the heavy lifting once the two devices already know and trust each other. Even in their differences, the two technologies quietly lean on each other's particular strengths. Let's talk honestly about a problem that quietly followed Bluetooth through its first decade of existence. Power consumption. Now, to be clear, from its very earliest design, Bluetooth was built with power efficiency genuinely in mind. Compared to many other wireless technologies of its era, it sipped power relatively modestly. But relatively modest still wasn't the same thing as negligible. And as Bluetooth found its way into more and more categories of small, battery-powered devices throughout the 2000s, this distinction started to matter more and more. Here's the underlying issue. Classic Bluetooth was designed primarily around maintaining active, ongoing connections, streaming audio continuously to a headset, maintaining a hands-free call, keeping a keyboard responsive to every keystroke. Even while technically idle, a classic Bluetooth radio still needed to stay reasonably active, continuing its rapid frequency hopping, continuing to listen for incoming data. This constant readiness came at a real, measurable cost in battery life. For a mobile phone, Bluetooth's power draw was manageable. But imagine a much smaller device, a fitness tracker, worn on your wrist, expected to last weeks between charges, or a small sensor, expected to run for years on a tiny embedded battery. For devices like these, classic Bluetooth's power requirements were simply fundamentally incompatible with what engineers wanted to build. By the late 2000s, an entirely new category of devices was emerging, an idea often described using the phrase Internet of Things. Small, often quite simple devices, embedded with sensors, designed to quietly collect and transmit small amounts of data, all without requiring frequent battery changes. Classic Bluetooth was a genuinely poor fit for most of this emerging category. In truth, most of these devices didn't actually need to send very much data at all. A heart rate sensor might only need to transmit a small handful of numbers once every few seconds. Classic Bluetooth's design was, in a real sense, over-engineered for this much simpler, much more intermittent kind of communication. The engineers within the Bluetooth SIG recognized this gap clearly, and rather than trying to awkwardly stretch the existing classic Bluetooth design to accommodate it, they made a genuinely bold decision. They would design an entirely new, parallel version of Bluetooth, built from the ground up around one central, overriding priority: radical power efficiency, even if that meant sacrificing some of classic Bluetooth's raw throughput and constant connectivity in exchange. This wasn't a small, incremental tweak. It represented years of dedicated engineering work, originating from a separate wireless technology called Weebri, developed initially by Nokia starting around 2001, which was eventually absorbed into and merged with the broader Bluetooth specification. Rather than existing as a competing standard, that combination arrived formally with the release of Bluetooth version 4.0 in the year 2010, and it introduced a genuinely transformative addition to the Bluetooth family, a version of the technology so fundamentally different in its underlying approach to power management that it earned its own distinct name. Bluetooth Low Energy, almost universally abbreviated simply as BLE, and BLE, more than perhaps any other single development in Bluetooth's entire history, is directly responsible for an enormous portion of the small, battery-sipping, wirelessly connected devices that now quietly surround most of our daily lives. Devices that simply wouldn't have been practical to build using classic Bluetooth's older, hungrier approach. It's worth appreciating just how significant a decision this actually was for the Bluetooth SIG to make. Rather than quietly patching classic Bluetooth's power draw with minor tweaks, they chose to build something genuinely new alongside it. Accepting the added complexity of maintaining two related but distinct underlying technologies under one shared brand name, that's a real gamble, technically and organizationally, for a standards body representing thousands of member companies with their own competing priorities. It paid off, but it required the same kind of patient, collaborative negotiation that had originally brought Ericsson, Nokia, Intel, IBM, and Toshiba together back in 1998, this time applied to an entirely new problem nobody had fully anticipated at the very beginning. Let's talk about Bluetooth Low Energy properly, slowly, because this single development quietly reshaped what kinds of devices were even possible to build. The core insight behind BLE, once you understand it, is genuinely simple, even elegant. Classic Bluetooth was designed around the assumption that devices would maintain fairly continuous, ongoing connections. That design makes complete sense for a headset streaming continuous audio. It makes considerably less sense for a small sensor that only occasionally has anything meaningful to say. BLE flips this underlying assumption almost entirely. Rather than maintaining a constant, always active connection, a typical BLE device spends the overwhelming majority of its time in a deep, low-power sleep state, its radio essentially switched off, drawing almost no power at all. Then, periodically, it briefly wakes up, sends a small, quick burst of data, and immediately goes right back to sleep. This behavior even has its own name within the technical specification: advertising. A BLE device in this mode periodically broadcasts a small advertising packet before immediately powering back down. Think of it a little like a lighthouse rather than a continuously burning street lamp. A street lamp, representing classic Bluetooth's always-on approach, burns constant energy to remain constantly visible. A lighthouse sweeps its light around only periodically, using dramatically less energy overall, while still remaining reliably detectable to anyone watching for it. This periodic advertising interval is itself configurable and represents a genuine trade-off that device manufacturers get to choose deliberately, depending on their specific use case. A device that needs to be discovered or respond quickly might advertise fairly frequently, sacrificing some battery life in exchange for responsiveness. A device that cares far more about squeezing out months of battery life might advertise much less frequently. This is precisely the underlying mechanism that lets a fitness tracker on your wrist, quietly monitoring your heart rate throughout the day and night, run for a week or more on a tiny battery the size of a coin. Something that would have been genuinely impossible using classic Bluetooth's much hungrier, always ready approach. It's worth being honest about the trade-offs here too. BLE typically moves considerably less data per second than classic Bluetooth, which makes it fundamentally unsuitable for something like continuous, high-quality audio streaming. This is precisely why, even today, your wireless headphones still typically rely on classic Bluetooth audio profiles for actually streaming music, while your fitness tracker relies on BLE for its own, much lighter, much more intermittent communication needs. Because of this, since Bluetooth 4.0's release in 2010, most modern Bluetooth chips are actually what's called dual mode, quietly containing support for both classic Bluetooth and Bluetooth Low Energy within the very same small piece of hardware, seamlessly. using whichever underlying approach best fits whatever task is currently at hand. The impact of this development, looking back now from a considerable distance, is genuinely hard to overstate. BLE is the quiet technical foundation underneath an enormous portion of what we now casually call smart devices. Fitness trackers and smartwatches monitoring your movement for days at a stretch on a single charge. Small, coin-sized tracking tags quietly broadcasting their location for months on a battery smaller than a fingernail. Smart home sensors silently reporting their status for years without ever needing a battery replacement. None of this would have been remotely practical using classic Bluetooth's older, power-hungry approach. BLE occupies a genuinely unique niche, a wireless technology efficient enough to run for months or years on a tiny battery, while still remaining reliable, standardized, and universally compatible across an enormous ecosystem of devices from countless different manufacturers. There's a gentle irony worth noticing here, too. BLE's entire design philosophy, waking briefly, saying what needs to be said, and returning immediately to a deep, patient silence, is not so different from the very thing this whole series is quietly built around. Small bursts of activity, surrounded by long, restful stretches of quiet. Somewhere in a drawer or on a nightstand near you tonight, a small sensor is likely doing exactly that right now. Sleeping, waking briefly, sleeping again, hour after hour, asking almost nothing of its battery in return. Now that we understand both classic Bluetooth and its low-energy sibling, it's worth actually opening up the hardware itself and looking inside, because everything we've discussed so far ultimately has to be physically implemented on a genuinely tiny piece of silicon, small enough to disappear invisibly inside a pair of earbuds or a coin-sized tracking tag. Let's shrink ourselves down for a moment and take a look inside the tiny piece of hardware that makes everything we've discussed so far actually physically possible. A modern Bluetooth chip is a genuinely remarkable object, easy to overlook precisely because of how small and unremarkable it looks from the outside. Often no larger than a grain of rice, it contains, packed into that tiny space, everything required to handle the entire elaborate dance we've spent this whole story describing. Let's walk through its major components slowly, because understanding roughly how they fit together helps demystify what can otherwise feel like pure unexplainable magic. At the physical edge of the system sits the antenna, the component actually responsible for converting electrical signals into radio waves that can travel through the air. In many small modern devices, this antenna isn't even a separate, visible component at all. It's often etched directly onto the device's circuit board itself, a carefully shaped tiny copper trace precisely designed to resonate efficiently at the 2.4 GHz frequencies Bluetooth operates within. Connected to this antenna sits the radio transceiver, sometimes just called the RF front end, short for radio frequency. This is the component directly responsible for the rapid frequency hopping we discussed earlier, precisely tuning itself to a new specific channel within that 2.4 GHz band, 1,600 times every single second for classic Bluetooth connections. Beneath the radio transceiver sits what's often called the baseband processor, or sometimes the link controller. This is the component managing much of the lower-level protocol logic we've discussed throughout this story, coordinating the precise timing of the frequency hopping sequence, managing the Piconet's master and slave synchronization, and managing error detection and correction. Sitting above this baseband layer is the higher-level Bluetooth protocol stack, the software layer responsible for managing pairing and security, handling the specific profile logic we discussed earlier, and generally presenting a clean, manageable interface that the device's broader software can use without needing to understand any of the underlying radio complexity directly. There's also, almost always, a small amount of dedicated memory built directly into the chip, used to store things like paired device information. Those link keys generated during the pairing process we discussed earlier, allowing a device to quickly and automatically reconnect to previously trusted devices without repeating the entire pairing process from scratch every single time. What's genuinely remarkable when you step back and consider it is how dramatically this entire system has shrunk and improved since Bluetooth's earliest days. Building a genuinely tiny, cheap, power-efficient Bluetooth chip, small enough to disappear inside a coin-sized tracking tag, required roughly 2 decades of steady, incremental semiconductor engineering. This miniaturization is precisely why Bluetooth found its way into such a genuinely staggering range of devices over the decades. As the chips shrank and their cost and power requirements dropped correspondingly, it became economically and technically feasible to include Bluetooth in increasingly small, increasingly inexpensive, increasingly power-constrained devices. So the next time you hold a pair of truly wireless earbuds, so small they can disappear entirely into a charging case, take a moment to appreciate what's actually packed inside that tiny space. An antenna, precisely tuned to 2.4 gigahertz, a radio transceiver hopping across 79 channels 1,600 times a second, a baseband processor managing synchronized timing with a paired device, all of it fitting comfortably onto something smaller than your fingernail. It's also worth mentioning that most of this manufacturing happens through a small handful of specialized semiconductor companies, licensing the underlying Bluetooth intellectual property from the SIG, then designing and fabricating their own particular chip implementations, each competing on price, size, and power efficiency, while all still adhering to that same shared specification we've spent this entire story exploring. This is, in its own quiet way, another echo of the original 1998 alliance. The rulebook is shared and open. The actual manufacturing, the silicon itself, remains a genuinely competitive marketplace, with dozens of companies racing to build the smallest, cheapest, most efficient version of essentially the same underlying idea. But having all of this radio capability packed into such a small, ubiquitous piece of hardware raises an important question we've only briefly touched on so far. If Bluetooth chips are genuinely everywhere, how secure is any of this, really? What stops someone with the right knowledge from listening in, or worse, actively interfering with a connection they were never supposed to have access to? That's a story with some genuinely uncomfortable early chapters, and it's exactly where we're headed next. Let's talk honestly about Bluetooth security, including some of its genuinely embarrassing early failures, because understanding what went wrong helps you appreciate just how much quiet, careful work has gone into fixing it over the years. In Bluetooth's earlier years, roughly through the mid-2000s, a handful of security vulnerability emerged that, in hindsight, feel almost quaint, but caused genuine concern at the time. One of the earliest and most talked about was something researchers and journalists dubbed bluejacking. This wasn't, strictly speaking, a dangerous attack at all, more of a mischievous prank made possible by a quirk in how early Bluetooth devices handled discovery, allowing pranksters to send anonymous, unsolicited messages to nearby strangers' phones. A more genuinely concerning vulnerability, discovered a bit later and dubbed bluesnarfing, exploited flaws in certain early device implementations that allowed an attacker, under specific conditions, to access data on a victim's phone without their knowledge, potentially including contact lists or calendar information. This highlighted a real weakness in how some manufacturers had implemented Bluetooth security model, sometimes leaving certain services accessible without properly enforcing authentication. These early vulnerabilities generally stemmed less from a fundamental flaw in Bluetooth's core cryptographic design and more from a combination of weak default settings, such as the simple, predictable PIN codes we discussed earlier, and inconsistent, sometimes careless implementation choices made by individual manufacturers racing to bring products to market. The Bluetooth SIG responded to this growing body of security research in several meaningful ways. We already discussed one of the most significant improvements, secure simple pairing, introduced with Bluetooth 2.1 back in 2007, which replaced the weak, often predictable PIN-based pairing system with genuine public key cryptography. Later versions of the specification continued strengthening security further still. Bluetooth 4.2, released in 2014, introduced improved privacy protections, specifically for Bluetooth low-energy devices, including a feature that periodically changes a device's publicly broadcast address, making it meaningfully harder for someone to track a specific device's movements over time simply by passively monitoring its BLE advertising broadcasts. More recent versions have continued this pattern, introducing stronger encryption algorithms, more robust authentication procedures, and closing various smaller vulnerabilities discovered by ongoing security research, a genuinely continuous process, since any sufficiently widely deployed technology attracts sustained, serious scrutiny. It's worth being honest and balanced about where this leaves things today. Modern Bluetooth, properly implemented on reasonably current hardware, offers genuinely robust security for the overwhelming majority of everyday consumer use cases. The cryptographic foundations are sound, and the historically weak points have been substantially addressed through nearly 2 decades of continuous refinement. That said, no wireless technology is ever perfectly, permanently unbreakable, and security researchers continue to discover and responsibly disclose new, more subtle vulnerabilities from time to time, exactly the kind of ongoing, unglamorous work that keeps any mature, widely deployed technology reasonably safe over the long run. There's also a broader lesson quietly buried in this whole security saga, one that applies well beyond Bluetooth alone. Any technology that becomes genuinely ubiquitous, embedded in billions of devices, carried in billions of pockets, inevitably becomes a genuinely attractive target for exactly this kind of scrutiny. That's not a flaw unique to Bluetooth. It's simply the price of widespread success. The reassuring part of the story is that the response to this scrutiny, patient, continuous, unglamorous patching and hardening across nearly 2 decades, is precisely the kind of quiet diligence that has kept Bluetooth trustworthy enough to remain sitting inside your headphones, your car, and your medical devices, largely without incident for all this time. So Bluetooth, having weathered its early growing pains around reliability and its early stumbles around security, settled into something genuinely mature and dependable by the 2010s. But the story doesn't end there, because in more recent years, Bluetooth has continued evolving in genuinely interesting directions, extending its reach in ways that would have seemed like genuine science fiction. Back when Haartsen and Mattisson first started sketching out a simple wireless replacement for a headset cable in 1994, let's bring our story closer to the present and look at where Bluetooth has actually ended up. 3 decades after 2 engineers in Lund, Sweden first started sketching out a simple wireless replacement for a headset cable, Bluetooth 5.0, released in 2016, marked a genuinely significant step forward. It roughly doubled the effective speed available for Bluetooth low-energy connections, while also introducing an optional long-range mode capable of extending reliable connections up to roughly 4 times further than earlier versions. At the cost of somewhat reduced data speed, Bluetooth 5.0 also introduced meaningfully improved broadcasting capabilities, allowing a single BLE device to broadcast noticeably more information within each small advertising packet than earlier versions permitted. This quietly enabled genuinely new categories of use, including something called Bluetooth mesh networking, formalized properly as an official standard shortly after Bluetooth 5.0's release. Much networking represents a genuinely different way of thinking about how Bluetooth devices connect to each other, compared to the simple Piconet structure we discussed much earlier in our story. A mesh network allows potentially hundreds or even thousands of individual Bluetooth devices to relay messages to each other across an entire building, each device capable of receiving a message and passing it along to its neighbors, gradually flooding a message across an extended physical area. Think of a large commercial building fitted with hundreds of individual smart light bulbs, each one a small BLE device. Rather than requiring every single light bulb to maintain a direct connection back to some central hub, a mesh network allows a single command to hop from bulb to bulb across the building, each bulb relaying the message onward to its nearby neighbors, until the command has propagated across an area far larger than any single Bluetooth radio could have reached directly. Beyond mesh networking, Bluetooth's more recent evolution has continued pushing into genuinely new territory. A more recent addition, sometimes referred to as Bluetooth LE audio, introduces an entirely new, more efficient way of encoding and transmitting audio over Bluetooth low-energy connections, aiming to eventually bring genuinely high-quality audio streaming into the same power-efficient framework traditionally reserved for much lighter BLE communication. This development also enables a single audio source to broadcast simultaneously to a potentially unlimited number of nearby listening devices. An entire room full of people, each wearing their own headphones, all tuning into the exact same audio broadcast from a shared source, without needing to be individually paired to it. And then there's a category of device that has become genuinely, remarkably popular in just the past few years. Small, coin-sized tracking tags designed to be attached to easily misplaced items, relying almost entirely on BLE's efficient, long-lasting broadcasting capabilities. These tiny devices periodically broadcast a small, quiet advertising signal and rely on a genuinely clever crowdsourced network. Other nearby phones, belonging to complete strangers, quietly anonymously detecting that faint broadcast signal and relaying its approximate location back to the tag's actual owner. Stepping back and looking at the broader picture, Bluetooth today sits at the quiet, invisible center of an enormous, genuinely staggering ecosystem. Billions of devices worldwide speaking a shared wireless language that traces its lineage directly back to those early experiments in Lund, Sweden in 1994, through the formation of an unlikely alliance between competing companies in 1998, through the radical power efficiency breakthrough of Bluetooth Low Energy in 2010, and onward into mesh networks, audio broadcasting, and quiet crowdsourced tracking networks today. It's a technology that succeeded, in the end, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through decades of patient, careful, largely unglamorous engineering, gradually refining and extending a shared standard that an entire industry, full of fierce competitors, somehow agreed to build together and to keep improving together, one specification revision at a time, for more than a quarter century now, and quietly counting. It's worth noticing, too, just how many hands this technology has quietly passed through to reach this point. 2 engineers in Lund refining a headset cable replacement. 5 competing companies setting rivalry aside long enough to write a shared rulebook. A Finnish research effort, Weebri, contributing the low-power foundation that would eventually become BLE. Thousands of member companies over more than 2 decades, each nudging the specification forward by some small specific amount. A new profile here, a security fix there, a broadcasting improvement somewhere else. No single person or company gets to claim ownership of Bluetooth today, and that, in its own way, is precisely the point. It became genuinely universal by remaining genuinely shared. And that brings us close to the natural end of this particular story. But before we close things out entirely, let's take a moment gently to bring everything we've covered back together. So let's bring this all the way back together, gently, one final time, before we let you drift off. Somewhere in your home tonight, quite possibly within arm's reach of wherever you're lying right now, there's a small device quietly listening, earbuds in their case, a smartwatch on your wrist, a speaker in the corner of the room. And in a moment, if you were to pick up your phone and press play, that small device would spring into a genuinely elaborate, invisible sequence of events, all happening in a fraction of a second, all completely hidden from your conscious awareness. It would begin, as we discussed, with a name that has absolutely nothing to do with radios or chips or engineering at all. A name borrowed from a Danish king who lived over 1,000 years ago, remembered, according to legend, for a darkened tooth, but remembered by history for something considerably more important, quietly uniting warring, quarreling factions under a single banner. It would continue with cables, an entire world not so very long ago, genuinely drowning in them, until a small team at a Swedish telecommunications company began quietly asking whether there might be a better way. It would involve an alliance, 5 fiercely competing corporations choosing, remarkably, to set their rivalry aside and build something together, recognizing that a shared, universal standard would ultimately be worth more to everyone than a proprietary advantage held jealously by just one of them alone. It would involve genuinely elegant physics, a slice of unlicensed radio spectrum, shared with microwave ovens and baby monitors, transformed from a crowded, chaotic neighborhood into something remarkably reliable, through the sheer clever trick of never sitting still, hopping across 79 separate channels, 1,600 times every single second. It would involve trust, a small, rapid cryptographic negotiation between two devices that had never met before, agreeing on a shared secret right out in the open through a piece of mathematics, elegant enough that even someone listening in couldn't reconstruct the secret being agreed upon. It would involve specialized languages, profiles, quietly ensuring that a keyboard's urgent keystrokes, a headset's continuous stream of music, and a fitness tracker's occasional heart rate reading never get confused with each other, each speaking its own careful dialect, layered gracefully on top of one shared underlying connection. It would involve a genuinely difficult problem, patiently solved, batteries too small and too precious to be drained by a radio that insisted on staying constantly, needlessly alert, solved by an entirely new approach built around sleeping deeply and waking only briefly, allowing a tiny sensor to run quietly for months, sometimes years, on a battery smaller than your fingernail. And it would involve, quietly underneath absolutely everything else, decades of unglamorous, careful engineering, chips shrinking generation after generation, vulnerability discovered and patched, one specification revision at a time, extending gracefully outward into mesh networks spanning entire buildings, and crowdsourced tracking networks spanning entire continents. All of that, the king, the cables, the alliance, the physics, the trust, the languages, the batteries, the decades of quiet refinement, all of it happens, invisibly, silently, in less time than it takes you to finish reading this very sentence. Every single time you press play, every single time your smartwatch buzzes gently on your wrist, every single time a small tracking tag helps someone, somewhere, quietly find their missing keys. You'll probably never think about any of this again tomorrow. You'll just press play, and the sound will simply, quietly arrive, which is, in its own way, exactly the point. The very best engineering has a habit of disappearing entirely from view, leaving behind only the simple, effortless experience it was always meant to create. So that's the story. From a Viking king's discolored tooth, to a torpedo patent held by a Hollywood actress, to the quiet, invisible conversation happening right now, in the dark, between your phone and whatever small device is patiently waiting nearby. See well. Somewhere close by, 79 channels are standing quietly ready, just in case you need them again in the morning.